Now, if you ever wondered about some of the compounds used during chemotherapy, which makes people feel absolutely terrible during chemotherapy as well, yes, this is exactly where they come from. They originate from plants. Shh. You hear that? God, not again. And that is the sound of science slowly dying. Honest to God, I wish companies didn't use science to progress their own agendas of making money, but hey, this is the world that we live in. Well, in this video, I'm going to be talking about plant toxins, and I will be referring to plant toxins as phytotoxins because that is their actual name, and we will be going into the science behind just how bad plant toxins are, and how basically every single time you eat plants, you're actually giving yourself a microdose of chemotherapy. And that might sound a little weird at first, but when we go into the science behind it, you'll see just how bad it gets. Now, that means that we'll be talking about inflammatory signals, and we'll also be talking a little bit about polyunsaturated fats towards the end, which plants have much more in abundance of than animals or animal meat. So yeah, we'll be going into detail about that as well. Now, I won't be going over every single phytotoxin because there are so many phytotoxins that plants have. In fact, there are probably so many to the point where we don't even know half of them. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount of phytotoxins. But what I will be covering is the ones that we do know about and we do have evidence of. And I'll also be basically covering why plants are so unbelievably harmful, and you'll get to see just how much damage, sort of from an inflammatory perspective anyways, plants can cause. Now, some of the information in this video will be linked back to my previous Science Behind Carnivore videos, so if you haven't seen those, I recommend you check those out so you get a better perspective as to how exactly carnivore works in the first place and why it works, and basically the biochemistry and the hard science behind it, working our way up from basic principles. And you'll be able to see just why it works so well and some of the benefits you have from removing plants from the diet, specifically far less inflammatory markers. So anyways, let's get to it. So first thing we have to do is we have to understand what exactly is the purpose of inflammation in the first place. Well, inflammation is caused specifically because of six or around main reasons. So one of them would be elimination of pathogens. One of them could be the removal of damaged cells. So that usually means necrosis or pyroptosis, sort of. We'll be going into a little bit more detail behind that. Recruitment of immune cells. It could be promotion of tissue repair, which that's related to senescent cells, prevention of further damage, and as you might guess, all of this basically activates the immune system. Now, we understand the purpose of inflammation, but we also have to understand some of the inflammatory signals. So what exactly are the signals that is causing this inflammation in the first place? And you'll see also how phytotoxins specifically will affect them as well. Now, the list of ways that inflammation is caused is completely endless, but I am just going to be covering around 8 of them. So the ones that we will be talking about are necrosis and damps, pyroptosis, ferroptosis, senescence, ER stress, which basically means endoplasmic reticulum stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, excessive reactive oxygen species or excessive ROS, inflammasomes like IL-1B and IL-18, and cytokine storms. So first, we'll start off with necrosis and damps. Now, what exactly is necrosis and damps? Well, necrosis is basically where the cell goes through unregulated cell death, and unregulated cell death is not good. And the reason is because unregulated cell death releases caspases, and caspases are an inflammatory signal, and your body gets a little worried because it goes, why did this cell die? Not correctly. When a cell dies correctly, it goes through apoptosis, and when a cell dies incorrectly, it goes through necrosis. And regulated cell death is apoptosis, unregulated cell death is necrosis. So when it goes through necrosis, that means that there might be some sort of pathogen there, and that would trigger the immune system. Now, damps, or damage-associated molecular patterns, are molecules released by stress and damaged or dying tissues in this case, and they are really important for the immune system to signal, hey, damage is basically occurring here. Now, DAMPs are different from PAMPs. PAMPs are from pathogens, pathogen-associated molecular patterns. DAMPs are specifically originate from the host cells. They are not from a pathogen. Now, when it comes to specifically necrosis and DAMPs being affected by phytotoxins, there are two in particular, and you might have heard of one of them. One of them would be ricin, and the other would be abrin. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole thing of how ricin was first used. Now, these plants aren't the only ones that are poisonous. These are the ones that are extremely poisonous. There are other ones that are slightly less poisonous, but still, they are poisonous regardless. But they cause these inflammatory signals maybe a little differently. Now, the second inflammatory signal that we'll be talking about is pyroptosis. Pyroptosis is where the cell does not die in a dysregulated way, but instead it happens through inflammasomes. Now, there are many phytotoxins that cause this, but one of them would be aflatoxins. Now, aflatoxins are found in ground nuts, tree nuts, maize, rice, figs, and other dried foods, spices, crude vegetable oils, and cocoa beans, just as some examples. And you can look up the list of plants that have aflatoxins if you're interested. Not only this, lectins as well also cause pyroptosis, and some examples of these might be found in peanuts, pumpkin, soy, squash, tomatoes, wheat, wild rice, zucchini, and all of those are also containing lectins. If you're interested in the list of lectins as well, I recommend you check out the list of plants that have lectins in them. Now, the third inflammatory signal that we'll be talking about is ferroptosis. Now, ferroptosis is where the cell goes through iron-dependent death. And this happens with lipid peroxidation, and I've talked about a lot about lipid peroxidation before, so I'm not going to go into detail about that, but yes. Now, ferroptosis can happen in many cells. It can happen in hepatocytes, which basically means liver cells. It can also happen in cardiomyocytes. It could happen in neurons. It could happen in kidney cells. I mean, there are so many places where ferroptosis can occur. And the problem is that, again, if we're talking about ferroptosis, plants can induce this, and that's not good because that basically means you're damaging those parts that I've mentioned before. Whether that mean liver, whether that mean neurons, whether that mean kidneys, whether that mean hearts, cardiomyocytes, which is heart cells. I mean, it's so bad. It's really, really bad. Now, which phytotoxins induce ferroptosis? Well, now, before we go into the list of phytotoxins that induce these inflammatory signals of ferroptosis, we have to first understand where we get this information in the first place. And might shock you a little bit, but this is where we talk about chemotherapy. Now, if you ever wondered about some of the compounds used during chemotherapy, which makes people feel absolutely terrible during chemotherapy as well, yes, this is exactly where they come from. They originate from plants. Plants will cause ferroptosis of the cancer cell. Now, obviously, this doesn't just happen with the cancer cell. It happens with tons of other cells around the body. That's why there is tons and tons of side effects during chemotherapy, because people experience tons and tons of these inflammatory signals and inflammatory markers, and it's ugly, it's nasty. I mean, talk to anybody who's went through chemotherapy before, I can guarantee you it has not been pleasant. Now, what are the compounds that I'm talking about exactly? Well, one of the compounds is solanine. Now, solanine is, again, another phytotoxin or plant toxin, and solanine is found in apples, potatoes, eggplants, cherries, bell peppers, tomatoes, and sugar beets, just as some examples. If you want to look at the list of plants that have solanine in them, I recommend you check that out yourself. And all of these chemicals are used to induce ferroptosis, once again. Another one would be curcumin. Now, curcumin is found in turmeric, and again, another drug that's used in chemotherapy. Another phytotoxin is artemisinin, and that is found in the leaves of wormwood, which comes from China. Again, it's another drug used in chemotherapy to promote ferroptosis. So every single time you're eating one of these plants, just remember you are giving yourself a microdose of chemotherapy, which I know it sounds ridiculous, but when we go to the science behind it, it's really true. Actually, I gotta be honest, I wouldn't even call this chemotherapy. I would just call this flat out torture. Take out the therapy part, just like chemo torture, to put it pretty simply. because it is a much simpler cure to all of this, and it's really depressing. Now, the fourth thing is senescence. Now, senescent cells basically are when cells stop going through apoptosis and they actually decide not to kill themselves. Now, these cells can sometimes be very, very helpful, and if they stay around a little bit too long, they can be incredibly harmful. Now, why exactly are senescent cells helpful? Well, the reason senescent cells are helpful is because they are important in tissue remodeling, and that tissue remodeling can also mean becoming cancer, but they are important in tissue remodeling. So the thing about senescent cells is senescent cells secrete pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines around them, and in the process, that means that they influence the other cells around them as well. Now, senescence is good if it's limited, but it's really bad if it's not limited. And you might guess why. It's because the cell isn't killing itself and has a chance of becoming cancerous. Now, senescence can be caused by many things. It can be caused from DNA damage. It can be caused from mitochondrial dysfunction. It can be caused in telomere shortening. It can be caused in oncogene activation or epigenetic changes. There's plenty of things that can affect senescence. And once again, senescence is used in chemotherapy drugs. And what's one of the chemotherapy drugs? Once again, the phytotoxin curcumin found in turmeric is used to help senescence occur. Another one that causes senescence is capsaicin. Now, this one you guys might have heard about before, and that's because you probably have. Capsaicin is basically just whenever food tastes spicy, yeah, that's where it comes from, capsaicin. Now, capsaicin can be found in chili peppers, habanero peppers, hot sauces, cayenne peppers, dried hot peppers, paprika, and certain spicy ketchups as well. If you're interested in all the plants that have capsaicin, I recommend you check that out yourself. There's a long list. Another phytotoxin that causes senescence is quercetin. Now, quercetin can be found in capers, red onions, shallots, red apples, grapes, berries, cherries, scallions, and again, it's used as a chemotherapy drug. So once you eat one of these again, just remember, it's like a small dose of chemotherapy. Now, the fifth inflammatory marker we'll talk about is ER stress, or endoplasmic reticulum stress. Now, in the endoplasmic reticulum, protein folding is what occurs. Now, some things that could stress the ER are an accumulation of misfolded proteins. One, a calcium imbalance, oxidative stress, nutrient deprivation, and chronic inflammation. Now, once again, what are the phytotoxins that induce ER stress? Solanine, found in potatoes, apples, eggplants, cherries, bell peppers, tomatoes, and sugar beets are all, again, some examples of chemotherapy drugs used to cause ER stress. The sixth inflammatory marker we'll be talking about is mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, I talked a lot about mitochondrial dysfunction and reactive oxygen species produced during the process of oxidative phosphorylation, but just to keep it really short, when glucose is oxidized, it causes a higher amount of reactive oxygen species. And again, this in turn can affect the mitochondria because it can mutate the DNA and cause DNA damage. Now, mitochondrial dysfunction can happen a couple ways. So one example would be genetic mutation, again, through reactive oxygen species. It could be oxidative stress, it could be environmental toxins, it could be nutrient deficiencies, and it could be inflammation. Now, what are phytotoxins that cause this mitochondrial dysfunction? Which we know about this, again, through the research of cancer cells. Well, one of them would be aflatoxins. Aflatoxins, again, that was one of our first ones, or around our first ones. Now, aflatoxins can be found in groundnuts, tree nuts, maize, rice, figs, and other dried fruits, spices, crude vegetable oils, and cocoa beans, just as some examples are known, again, to cause mitochondrial dysfunction. And again, solanine here to make a return, found in potatoes, apples, eggplants, cherries, bell peppers, tomatoes, and sugar beets, just as some examples, again, used in chemotherapy. Again, absolutely wild. Now, the eighth inflammatory marker that I'll be talking about are inflammasomes. Now, inflammasomes are activated through stress response, and I'm not going to be going through all the inflammasomes, but I'll be talking about the phytotoxins that do cause these inflammasomes to appear. Well, what are they? Number one, lectins, here to make a return, are found in peanuts, pumpkins, soy, squash, tomatoes, wheat, wild rice, zucchini, and they are all known to cause an inflammasome response. And a new one that we haven't heard of in a while, oxalates. And oxalates are found in basically every single plant. Oxalates, and I'll be mentioning a lot of them, but you'll just see just how long they are. Spinach, rhubarb, beet greens, Swiss chard, sweet potatoes, okra, almonds, miso soup, sesame seeds, nuts and butters and nut butters, peanuts and cashews, soy products like tofu, soy milk, wheat bran, amaranth, starfruit, navy beans, buckwheat, black tea, purslane, collard greens, all of them cause inflammasome responses. Now, the eighth and final one is cytokine storms. Now, cytokine storms are when basically tons of cytokines get released to a certain area, and that's where the autoimmune problems start to happen. And just a note about cytokine storms, they're usually a little bit sort of uncontrolled, and they're quite excessive. So, what plant toxins cause cytokine storms? Well, oxalates, here for round 2. Now, again, I won't mention all of them, I'll just mention some of them. So spinach, rhubarb, beet greens, Swiss chard, sweet potatoes, okra, almonds. Now, these are just some of the phytotoxins that induce inflammatory responses. There are a lot of other things that phytotoxins can do. And just some of them would be oxalates, causing 5 out of 9 of the primary hallmarks of aging. Or oxalates also causing nutrient malabsorption. Now, yes, oxalates do cause this. And what's the list of phytotoxins? Well, again, we'll go over it. And again, you see just how inedible these things are if you really look at it from a long-term perspective. So, spinach, rhubarb, beet greens, Swiss chard, sweet potatoes, okra, almonds, miso soup, sesame seeds, nuts and nut butters like peanuts, cashews, soy products, tofu, soy milk, wheat bran, amaranth, starfruit, navy beans, buckwheat, black tea, purslane, collard greens, and there are plenty of more. It's really messed up. And honestly, there are so many phytotoxins that cause nutrient malabsorption, so I'm not going to go into the list of those, but just to let you know, there's plenty of more. Now, there is another phytotoxin which causes extreme damage, and actually it's during the process of oxidative phosphorylation. Cyanogenic glycosides. Now, cyanogenic glycosides, they basically release cyanide whenever they feel mechanical stress, and that basically means when they feel crunching or an animal eating them. Now, there is no healthy level of cyanide at all, and cyanide is very, very dangerous. In fact, it's actually a poison, and the way it works is it binds to cytochrome C oxidase, and when it binds to cytochrome C during oxidative phosphorylation, problems really happen because it completely inhibits the process of oxidative phosphorylation and generating ATP in the first place. Now, some of the things that have cyanogenic glycosides in them in the first place are almonds, cassava, and certain fruit seeds like apple or cherry or peach. You can look up the list of seeds that have them. Now, again, this is a very, very small list of the list of phytotoxins that plants have. I am not covering all of them in this video, which I know that might sound a little ridiculous, but yeah, it's a long list. Now, there are some symptoms as well that come with inflammation, and we might have all experienced this before, so some just quick examples might be redness, heat, swelling, pain, loss of function, fatigue, fever, joint pain, stiffness, or muscle stiffness, and headaches, just as some, to name a few. Now, if you have any of those, just to let you know, it could be because of plants. Now, there is something a little bit more interesting when it comes to understanding this whole plant thing, and actually it has to do with aging itself. Now, aging is really actually increased by plants, and why is that? Well, that has to do with polyunsaturated fats. Now, we already talked about before how polyunsaturated fats are in higher concentrations in plants than they are in animal meat. Now, if you remember a little bit about my previous video talking about reactive oxygen species and lipid peroxidation, things might come together and make, again, a little bit more sense. So if we look at basically age or lifespan throughout the animal kingdom, we will see that size does seem to correlate with age. And there are, though, some exceptions, and some exceptions might be the naked mole rat, it might be humans, or it might even be sloths. Now, all of these animals, including us basically, are outliers in terms of the lifespan relative to size. Now, why exactly might that be? Well, it could actually be because of membrane fatty acid composition. Now, membrane fatty acid composition is basically whether or not the membrane has basically saturated fats or polyunsaturated fats. Now, if it has more saturated fats, that means, again, we talked about before, saturated fats are more stable. And in being more stable, that comes longer lifespan because there is less likely of a chance for that saturated fat molecule to react. Versus a polyunsaturated fat molecule, which again is more likely to react because it has that double bond and it has a lone pair of electrons that can be reactive. And once again, that means that the fats that are easier to oxidize because they have a lower activation energy, specifically the polyunsaturated fats because they are more reactive, are more likely to react, and in turn, they increase the rate of aging. Versus the saturated fats, which are less likely to react and in turn less likely to increase the rate of aging. Hopefully in this video I taught you a little bit about how unbelievably damaging plants are, and if you're really interested in some of the plants that humans might have eaten before, you will have to find them in their wild type forms, which are highly fibrous, as many of the plants today are not in their wild type forms and are actually quite genetically modified through selective breeding ever since probably tens of thousands of years ago, maybe a little bit longer. So yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something in this video. If you did, please give the video a like. It helps it a lot. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below. And if you have any video ideas as well, please leave them again in the comments below. And that'll be it. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Peace.